I moved in with Dean on a Tuesday. It was raining. Not the soft, cinematic kind of rain. This was sharp, cold, indifferent. The kind that reminded you the world wasn't built to cushion your falls. I had one suitcase, a duffel bag, and a sketchbook with the corners curled from being stuffed into too many backpacks. No plan, no job, no home. Just the bare minimum and a favor I wasn't sure I deserved. Dean met me at the door without a smile. He didn't offer to take my bag or ask how I'd been. He just looked me over once, like a drill sergeant checking a faulty line, and stepped aside. The room's down the hall. Keep your shoes off inside. And, he added without turning around, just don't bring your lifestyle here. There it was. 14 words.
No slurs. No yelling.
Just a wall, brick-laid in silence. I nodded, because what else was I supposed to do? Dean was ex-military. You could tell from the way he walked, straight-backed, sharp turns, arms always slightly tensed. His apartment was spotless. Not clean. Spotless. Every mug had a place. Every towel had a fold. There was nothing soft about the space. No throw pillows, no pictures, no warmth. My room had white walls and a single window that looked out onto an alleyway. The bed was stiff but clean. A desk sat in the corner with nothing on it except a note in all-caps block handwriting. No loud music. No strangers. Keep the door shut. I unpacked in silence. Folded my clothes. Lined my art supplies on the windowsill. This wasn't home. But it was shelter. For now, that was enough. I'd met Dean once, years ago, when he came to pick up my older brother from school. They were friends. The kind that didn't say much, just nodded at each other with shared respect. Dean had barely looked at me back then. He certainly didn't remember me when I called. Desperate and half choking through the words. But he said yes. Not warmly. Just yes. Maybe guilt made him say it. Maybe my brother asked him. Maybe it was pity. I didn't care. I just needed somewhere to exist without getting screamed at for it. The first few nights, I kept my headphones on, even when I wasn't listening to anything. I cleaned up after myself, washed every dish, double-checked that nothing of mine was ever out of place. I became a ghost in my own space, quiet, careful, invisible. Dean kept to himself. He left early for work, came back around sunset, and made exactly 2 cups of coffee every morning. One for himself, one that he left steaming on the table, untouched, until it went cold. He never offered it to me. And still, I said thank you every time he passed me in the kitchen. He never replied. There were little signs, subtle digs. The way he'd click his tongue if I wore something too bright. The way he'd refer to me as your roommate when talking to someone on the phone, never using my name. The way his eyes stiffened whenever a queer character showed up on the TV screen, and he'd change the channel like a reflex. But he never shouted, never used the F word, never kicked me out. That almost made it worse, because hatred you can name. This was like breathing underwater. You don't die immediately. You just slowly learn to take smaller breaths. I tried not to hate him. I really did, because I'd grown up with that same cold silence. I knew its shape, knew the weight of it. I had lived my whole life being too much or too soft or just don't make a scene. I didn't need Dean to hug me. I didn't even need him to accept me. I just needed a door that shut, a ceiling that didn't leak, and a space where I could rebuild. One night, I came home a little late. Therapy had run over, and I found Dean sitting on the couch, staring at the TV with the volume low. Some old war documentary was playing. I nodded as I walked past him. He didn't nod back, but his eyes followed me, just for a second longer than usual, like he was trying to figure something out. Like I'd done something wrong by existing quietly. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay staring at the cracks in the ceiling, wondering how long I could keep walking on eggshells before something cracked underfoot. But still I stayed, because I'd survived worse. Because I didn't want to run again. Because even if Dean hated every part of me he wouldn't say out loud, I wasn't going to apologize for breathing. Dean never used slurs. He never shouted. Never called me names. Never told me outright to leave. But the silence around him was loud, thicker than walls. He didn't need to insult me to make me feel unwelcome. His disapproval hung in the air like humidity, something you couldn't see but always felt pressing on your skin. It was in the way he grunted instead of responding when I said, "Good morning," and how he rolled his eyes if I laughed too loudly at something on my phone. In the long pauses between my presence and his reactions, as if he had to think carefully about whether I deserved one. Once, I caught him muttering under his breath after I mentioned a childhood friend who'd just gotten married, to a man. "You people always want attention," he said, barely above a whisper. I almost asked what he meant by "you people," but I didn't. I just nodded once, turned back to my tea, and told myself to let it go. Because you don't argue with ghosts. And that's what Dean was, a haunted man. I was just beginning to realize how deep that went. Late one night, around 2 a.m., I got up to grab water. As I passed the living room, I saw a strange flicker of light coming from the TV. The sound was off, completely silent. Dean sat on the couch, still in his jeans, staring at the screen. A film was playing. I couldn't hear the dialogue, but the scene was unmistakably romantic. Two men, slow dancing in an empty bar. Soft lighting, hands grazing backs. One leaned in. Dean didn't notice me. His shoulders were hunched, jaw tight. He wasn't leaning forward like someone enjoying a movie. He looked like someone enduring one. Like it hurt. I walked backward quietly and didn't say anything. The next morning, the TV was unplugged. Dean didn't come out of his room all day. Another time, I heard him in the shower, sobbing. Not sniffling. Not quietly wiping his eyes. Sobbing. It stopped suddenly, as if he'd choked it down or punched a wall. When he came out 20 minutes later, his eyes were red, but he blamed it on shampoo. "Got some in my eye," he muttered, not meeting mine. I didn't say anything, but I wanted to. I wanted to ask if he was okay. I wanted to ask if he'd ever been safe enough to cry in front of someone without apologizing for it. I wanted to ask who hurt him, but I didn't, because something in his posture said, "Don't." Over time, the patterns became clearer. He'd slam his door after I mentioned meeting an old friend for lunch. Always a guy, never a date, but he'd tense anyway. If I wore something even slightly fitted, he'd suddenly find an excuse to leave the room. He kept a tight schedule, workouts at dawn, work during the day, home at 6, dinner at 7. But on the nights when I had video calls with friends, he always stayed later. Came in around 10, sometimes 11, as if avoiding me was part of the routine. And yet, there were moments, flickers, when he looked at me like I was holding up a mirror he didn't want to face. I remember one night clearly. I was painting in the living room, headphones on, music low. I'd set up a small corner with a folding easel and some watercolor paper. Nothing dramatic, just a portrait. Two figures holding hands, faceless but gentle. Intimate without being explicit. Dean walked in. I paused the music but didn't say anything. I could feel him behind me, standing there too long. Looking. He didn't speak. He just let out a long breath through his nose, like something inside him had deflated. Then he turned and left. The next day, the painting was gone. Just gone. I asked if he'd seen it. He said, "No. Probably got lost in your mess." There was no mess. I started to wonder, was he angry at me or angry at himself? That's when the suspicion started taking shape. A quiet theory I kept locked in the back of my mind. Dean wasn't just uncomfortable with me being gay. He was terrified of what it stirred in himself. It made me rethink everything. The late nights, the muttered judgments, the silence after certain movies, the way he always stared a second too long when I laughed without shame. It wasn't hate. Not really. It was fear. It was grief. It was maybe longing. But suspicion isn't certainty. And sympathy doesn't make it easier to live inside a house that feels like a museum of unspoken things. There was no warmth.
Noise.
No space to be soft without feeling like I'd made the air too heavy. One night I got bold. I asked, "Did you ever know someone? Before me?" Dean's expression hardened instantly. "What kind of question is that?" "I don't know," I said. "Just wondering." He didn't respond. Just walked into his room and shut the door. Loud. A minute later, the hallway light went off too. That was our rhythm. I breathed. He flinched. I smiled. He looked away. I existed, and that was the threat. But I stayed. Because somewhere under all that ice, I swore I saw something beating. Not yet thawed, but trying. I'd gone to bed early. Exhausted. It had been a good day. 3 commissions completed, 1 new client, even a quick call with a childhood friend who hadn't judged me for vanishing when things got hard. I fell asleep quickly, the kind of heavy sleep that doesn't let you dream. Just darkness, thick and uninterrupted, until something pulled me up. It wasn't noise exactly. It was a feeling, like someone had stepped into the room and the air had changed shape. I blinked, groggy, and turned my head toward the door. It was open, just a few inches, and in the crack between the hallway and my room, I saw Dean, standing there, still, silent. His face was unreadable in the low light, half shadow, half expression. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. He was just watching me. I didn't move, didn't say anything. My heart pounded, but my body stayed frozen. Not out of fear, but out of sheer confusion. How long had he been there? A second? A minute? More? Then, as if he'd felt me wake, Dean turned. Slowly, and without a word, he walked away. The door remained open. I didn't sleep after that. I stared at the ceiling until the sun came up, listening to the faint sounds of his movements. The kettle boiling, the clink of a mug, his footsteps crossing the apartment in his usual rhythm. When I finally emerged, he was at the table, reading something on his phone. He didn't look up. I sat down across from him. Waited. Nothing. No good morning.
No epalegy. No explanation.
Just silence. The same wall, but now with a crack in it. That day I couldn't focus. Every little moment replayed in my mind like a scratched record. Why was he standing there? What was he thinking? Did he know I was awake? There was no rational reason for it. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. This wasn't the stare of a man who hated me. It wasn't even the stare of a man confused by me. It was the look of someone who saw in me what he couldn't name in himself. Something he'd buried, burned, hidden for so long that it now frightened him to see it reflected back. I told my therapist about it. She asked, gently, "Did you feel unsafe?" "No," I said, "just seen. But not in the way I wanted to be." After that night, Dean didn't act any different. Not really, but I did. I stopped tiptoeing, stopped lowering my voice, stopped pretending I wasn't occupying space. I didn't need him to approve of me, but I needed me to stop shrinking. And if he saw that, good, let him watch. I waited 3 days. 3 long, silent days after that night. The night I woke up to find Dean standing in my doorway like a ghost with something he couldn't say. 3 days of pretending we hadn't seen each other. 3 days of fake mornings and clinking spoons and half-shut doors. But something in me had changed. I couldn't go back to shrinking just because he was still scared of his own reflection. So, on the 4th night, I waited until he got home from work. He came in like usual. Boots heavy, shoulders squared, keys tossed into the bowl by the door like he was throwing off armor. I was at the kitchen table, sketchpad open but untouched. When he walked past, I didn't move. "Dean," I said, calm, even. He paused, didn't turn. "Can I ask you something?" I continued. He still didn't turn, but he let out a sigh like a warning. I asked anyway, "Why do you hate me?" He froze. The question dropped like glass between us. Not loud, but sharp. Finally, he turned around. "I don't hate you," he said, jaw clenched. "Don't flatter yourself." I nodded. "Okay, then what is it? Because you don't talk to me. You barely look at me. And then you're standing in my room at 3 in the morning like I'm a ghost you can't decide whether to exorcise or worship." That got him. His face twisted, something flaring in his eyes that looked too raw to be just anger. "I don't hate you," he said again, louder this time. "I hate that you're not hiding." I blinked. "What?" "You walk around here like it doesn't cost you anything. You laugh. You paint. You exist. You exist so loudly." I laughed once. Not cruelly. Just bitterly. "That's funny," I said. "I thought I was trying so hard not to take up space." He shook his head. pacing now. You don't get it. You come in here, all proud of who you are, like you've never had to choke it down or bury it or… Have you? I asked softly. He stopped. His breathing was hard. Fast. His fists clenched like he was gripping something he didn't want to drop. You make it look easy, he spat. I stood slowly. It's not easy. It's never been easy. But I stopped apologizing for breathing. He stared at me, and in that moment the soldier cracked. I used to go to bars 2 towns over, he said. His voice was low, trembling, like it didn't want to be heard but couldn't help escaping. Before the military, I'd sit in the back. I never said a word, just watched. I'd leave before anyone noticed me. I thought if I just watched, it would be enough. He looked at me like I was a wound he tried to stitch shut years ago, only to find it still bleeding. I signed up for the army the day after a man tried to talk to me in one of those bars. He continued. He just said hello. That was it. I couldn't even say it back. I enlisted to outrun the word yes. I felt my throat tighten. He laughed bitterly. Worked too. 6 years of silence. 6 years of being the man's man. Of marching. Of orders. Of keeping it all in a box so tight I forgot what was even inside. And now? I asked. He looked away. Now you're here. Existing. I nodded slowly. So that's what this is? You hate that I remind you of the person you buried. No, he said, almost a whisper. I hate that I never got to be him. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was sacred, like standing in a church built out of grief. I felt everything. The anger, the sadness, the resentment. But what I felt most was exhausted. Not of him, of shrinking. So I looked him straight in the eyes and said, I'm sorry you were never given space. I really am. But I won't make myself small so you can stay comfortable. He didn't answer. I'm not ashamed of who I am. Not anymore, I continued. I won't apologize for breathing. Not even for your sake. Then I picked up my bag. He blinked. Where are you going? Somewhere I can breathe, I said. I didn't slam the door when I left. I didn't cry on the stairs. I just walked, steady, calm, like someone who finally remembered their worth wasn't up for debate. That night, I crashed on a friend's couch. She didn't ask questions, just handed me a blanket and said, You're safe here. It was the first time in months I fell asleep without listening for footsteps in the hall. I came back on a Sunday, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. Most of my belongings were still in Dean's apartment. Clothes, books, my art portfolio, and a ceramic mug I'd carried since college with a chipped rim and the words "Don't apologize" for existing scratched on the side. I told myself I'd be in and out in 10 minutes. No eye contact, no conversation, just grab and go. But when I opened the front door, Dean was already there, sitting at the kitchen table. He wasn't eating, wasn't pretending to read the news or sip his coffee like usual. He was just waiting. I stepped in slowly. He didn't stand, just looked up at me once, then looked down again at something on the table. There, in front of him, was one of my art prints, a digital piece I'd finished the month before. It wasn't flashy, just 2 figures sitting on opposite sides of a couch, hands almost touching. You couldn't see their faces, but the tension between them was unmistakable. Aching, electric, real. I remembered printing it on thick matte paper and placing it near my sketchpad. I hadn't even realized it was missing. Dean pushed it toward me. No words yet, just a quiet offering. I found it the morning after you left, he said finally, voice low, steady. It was behind the microwave. I didn't say anything. I didn't even reach for the print. He looked at me then, really looked, and for once, there was no anger.
No armor.
You're brave, he said. I never was. The room didn't feel heavy, felt hollow, like a confession echoing in a church that hadn't heard prayer in years. I didn't know what to do with it, he continued. I wanted to throw it away, burn it maybe, but I couldn't. I stared at it for hours. He swallowed hard, still not meeting my eyes. I hated how much it looked like me. I glanced down at the figures in the drawing. One of them had Dean's shoulders, his posture, his way of sitting like he always had a weight on his chest that no one could see. And the other one? I asked quietly. That one scared me even more, he said. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. I wasn't trying to fix you, I said after a moment. I know. I wasn't trying to seduce you. I know. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I just wanted to be safe, I whispered. Somewhere. He nodded slowly. And I made you feel unsafe. I didn't answer that. He already knew. After a moment, he stood. Not dramatically. Not as a gesture. Just because sitting was suddenly too much. I used to tell myself it was a phase, he said, pacing slowly to the window. When I was a teenager. Then in my 20s. Then in my 30s. Eventually, I just stopped asking the question. He turned back to me. I built a life out of silence. And now? I asked. He didn't answer. Not directly. Instead, he walked over to the counter, picked up a small envelope, and handed it to me. I opened it. Inside was a photo, old, creased. 2 boys standing side by side at a lake, sunburnt and smiling. That's me, he said. And the other one? His name was Micah. I felt my stomach tighten. We were 17, he said softly. We kissed once. Just once. After that, I never spoke to him again. He looked away. He died in a car crash 2 years later. I never said sorry. I never said goodbye. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. Sometimes grief doesn't need an audience. It just needs room. Finally, I walked to the table and gently picked up the art print. Keep it, I said. Dean looked up. I think you need it more than I do. He blinked a few times, nodded once. Still no hug, no breakdown, just a moment, an understanding. I gathered the rest of my things in quiet. Dean didn't follow, didn't linger in the hallway or try to stop me. He just stood by the window, holding the drawing like it was more fragile than it looked. As I reached the door, I turned back. I hope you find peace, Dean, I said. Whatever that looks like for you. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't need to. When I stepped outside, the air was different, cooler, lighter, like someone had finally opened a window in a house full of old dust and forgotten feelings. And as I walked away, I realized something. His apology hadn't been loud, but it had been real, and sometimes that's enough. The thing about starting over is that it doesn't feel like a rebirth. It feels like dragging your body uphill with no promise of a view. But I climbed anyway. I moved in with a friend for a few weeks, a sunlit apartment above a bookstore, where the smell of paper and fresh coffee seeped into everything. The bed was too soft. The shower pressure was weak. But it was safe. It was mine. And slowly, I stopped surviving and started living. I opened up commissions again, not just digital portraits, but something different. Raw. Vulnerable. I drew what silence felt like. I painted what it meant to live in a room with a locked heart on the other side of a paper-thin wall. I didn't know it yet, but people would start calling those paintings survival pieces. A therapist I knew, the same one who helped me through the worst of it, reached out one day. She was starting a small LGBTQ plus art therapy group for teens. They needed someone who had been there. Not just someone trained, she said. Someone who's survived something and didn't turn bitter. I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. The first session, I was terrified. They were all younger than I'd expected, some barely 15. I introduced myself with shaking hands and no script. Told them I was gay, that I'd been kicked out, that I'd lived with someone who hated what I was, or maybe hated what he couldn't be. They listened, and then they drew. What came out of them wasn't polished or precise, but it was honest. One kid drew a heart locked in a birdcage. Another drew a closet full of shadows. One just scribbled until the page tore. I told them it was perfect, because it was. Weeks turned into months, and somehow, in that time, I became something I never expected. A voice other people listened to. Someone suggested I write about it all. Not just what happened with Dean, but the wider experience. The silence, the shame, the survival. I called it Rooms Without Doors. A small indie press picked it up. I didn't expect much. But the emails started pouring in. From kids, parents, veterans, people who had spent decades swallowing words they couldn't say. Then came the university invitation, a panel on queer identity and healing spaces. I was asked to speak alongside therapists, professors, and a poet whose words I'd once clipped to my sketchbook. I said yes, not because I felt like I belonged, but because maybe someone like me would be sitting in the back row, unsure if they deserved to take up space. The panel was in a wide lecture hall with bright lights and squeaky chairs. I wore black jeans, a soft blue shirt, and shoes that didn't pinch. I kept my notes folded in my back pocket, but I didn't use them. I told the truth. I spoke about the art group, about being disowned, about choosing not to shrink. I said, sometimes silence isn't peace, it's pressure. And we live for years thinking the tightness in our chest is normal. It's not. The room was so quiet, I could hear people breathing. And then, I saw him, Dean, standing at the back wall.
No uniform. No skobl.
Just stillness. He wasn't sitting, wasn't hiding. He stood straight, like always, arms folded, eyes locked on me. My heart didn't race. My voice didn't falter. I just acknowledged him with a glance, a single nod. He didn't smile. He didn't nod back. But he stayed, until the final question of the panel. And then he slipped out.
No gudie. No confrontation.
Just the soft sound of the door clicking shut. I didn't chase him. I didn't need to. That moment, brief and wordless, meant more than 1,000 apologies ever could. He had come, not to argue, not to shame, just to witness. And somehow that was enough. Afterward, someone asked how I stayed so calm on stage. I smiled. It's easy, I said, when you've already survived the loudest silences. After the panel ended, people lined up to speak with me. Some held copies of my book. Others just said thank you in a quiet, reverent way, like I'd said something they weren't ready to say themselves. But what I remember most was the last question, asked by a kid with shaking hands and a voice so soft the moderator had to repeat it into the mic. How do you forgive someone who never says sorry? The room went still. That kind of question doesn't ask for a rehearsed answer. It asks for a scar. I leaned forward in my chair, my fingers pressed into my thighs, grounding me. I didn't need to think. I used to live with someone who hated me, I said. Or at least, I thought he did. The room leaned in. He never used slurs, never raised a hand. But he didn't have to. Silence can be louder than shouting. Judgment can live in a look. And sometimes, the person hurting you doesn't even know they're bleeding too. I paused. My throat tightened, not with pain anymore, but with the weight of clarity. He hated that I was free, I said, because he wasn't. And I reminded him of a version of himself he'd spent years trying to bury. Some heads nodded. Others didn't move at all. Listening, absorbing. There's a kind of revenge, I continued, that doesn't need payback.
No confrontation.
No shouting match. Just becoming the version of yourself they couldn't break. I let that sit for a moment. Some people hate what they see in you, and not because you're wrong, but because you're proof they lost the fight inside themselves. Someone gasped quietly in the audience. A few people wiped their eyes. I folded my hands in my lap. And sometimes, the best closure, I said, is knowing they saw you bloom, even if they never stayed long enough to say they were proud. The silence that followed was deep, not awkward, reverent. Then slowly the clapping began. Not explosive, not theatrical, but rising wave by wave, like the room had exhaled something it didn't know it was holding. Dean wasn't there. I'd looked during the Q&A, during the last applause, but his corner at the back wall was empty, and I realized that was okay. He didn't need to be there anymore, because this moment wasn't about him. It never really was. It was about me and the version of myself I refused to bury. I stepped outside after the event. The air was sharp and clean, the kind that smells like something is starting over. A student caught up to me. She looked barely 18, with nervous eyes and a bracelet made of safety pins. Was that real? She asked. What you said about him? I nodded. Every word. She looked down, then back up. I think I'm living with someone like that. My heart ached a little. You won't always be, I said gently. You'll get out. You'll find light. Just don't let them dim yours. She smiled, small, like a secret being born, and disappeared into the crowd. That night, I sat by my window. No roommate in the next room. No footsteps in the hallway. Just quiet. But not the suffocating kind. The peaceful kind. The earned kind. I opened my sketchbook and began drawing again. 2 figures side by side. This time their hands touched. I never heard from Dean again. No message. No call.
No, I'm sorry.
But a few weeks later, a donation showed up under a different name, made to the LGBTQ plus Teen Art Therapy Fund. No signature. Just a note attached that read, "For the ones who still think they're too broken to be whole." That was enough. Not a grand apology. Not redemption. But the sound of something shifting, deep inside someone who once stood in my doorway, watching me sleep like a man trying to remember who he could have been. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I disagree. The best revenge is served warm, at your own table, with peace, purpose, and no chair left for bitterness. And when you look across the room and realize your greatest triumph wasn't that you survived them, it's that you outgrew them. If this story meant something to you, even a little, leave a comment. Tell me if you've ever had to grow in silence, or forgive someone who never said sorry. And if you're still finding your way, you're not alone. Hit like, subscribe, and come back next time for more stories that speak the quiet truths.